This is our last lesson of this module and it's dealing with paraphrasing. So paraphrasing is saying the same thing but in a different way. So not only do you have to paraphrase the question as you would in the introduction, but you have to also paraphrase your own words so that you avoid repeating yourself. It's a very important skill in task 1 and 2, but it's also really helpful in your reading and listening exams because you'll find paraphrasing everywhere. So in this lesson, we're going to deal with how to paraphrase common task 1 topics, how to paraphrase time, and how to use referencing to avoid repetition. So let's start with common task 1 topics. If you go to page 20, you will find these topics on there. So take some time out to paraphrase these for me. You can keep some of the key words like meat, electricity or sales, and pollution. So these are key topic words that you cannot really change completely, but try to change the rest into either a different form or try to use the passive voice and so on. Let's go through the answers now. So meat consumption can be paraphrased to the consumption of meat. So you change the word order. Or you can say the amount of meat consumed, or how much meat was eaten, or the quantity of meat eaten or consumed. So these two in particular are the passive voice. They're in the passive voice. The estimated sales of smartphones can be paraphrased to the projected sales of smartphones, or how many smartphones are predicted, forecasted, or expected to be sold. So we're paraphrasing estimated here, which is the key word. You paraphrased it into projected or into predicted, forecasted, or expected. The degree or level or percentage of employment. So rate can be paraphrased to these three instead. Transformation of Scottsdale, the renovation or the conversion of Scottsdale. So we're looking at transformation. Or you can say the plan of transforming Scottsdale into a modern town, for example. So as you can see, I've changed the form of the word in this case, and because of that, it's paraphrased. Pollution levels. So you would need to paraphrase levels and say the rate or the amount of pollution, or how much or the amount of pollution that was released into the air, for instance. Annual expenditure. You can paraphrase both of them. So annual means yearly, basically. So you can say yearly spending or spending in a year. Electricity generation can be changed into production or the creation of electricity, or you can say electricity production or electricity creation. If you want to use the passive voice, you would say how electricity is made or produced. So that's how you would paraphrase these different task 1 topics. Let's have a look at now countries and nationalities. And so in most of the questions, you'll probably find a country, and one way of paraphrasing countries is to use their nationalities instead. So in this table, you have the different endings of nationalities, and over here you've got different countries. So what I want you to do is change these countries into nationalities by putting them in the correct column. So let's have a look at the answers now. So here it is. One thing you can do is that you can word them in different ways, in ways where you can actually end up with noun phrases. So for instance, if we use Poland as an example, so you can say citizens of Poland, for instance. So you can say Polish citizens, or residents of Poland, or Polish residents. Another one is households, which is quite common actually, and this can be paraphrased into families. So you can either say Polish households or Polish families. So let's move on now to paraphrasing time. So you can actually paraphrase years. Instead of saying in 1986 it went up, and then in 1990 it plummeted, in 1992 it recovered. There are other ways of saying time without having to mention the actual year. So let's have a look at this example paragraph. So in the first 4 years, the number of tourists have gradually increased. So as you can see, I've paraphrased from 1984 to 1988. I've paraphrased it into in the first 4 years. And then in the following year, or in the subsequent year, so you need to choose one, do not use both of them, it plummeted to 2%. So now instead of saying it plummeted to 2% in 1990, I said that in the following or in the subsequent year. Then in the next 2 years, so from 1990 to 1992, in the next 2 years, it sharply rose to 6%. By 1993, it dipped slightly and then remained constant over a 3-year period. So over a 3-year period from 1994 to 1996, and then post 1996 it grew marginally. So try to paraphrase the year, so do not always say the year again and again. So remember, you need to show flexibility, and one way of showing that is to paraphrase as much as you can. Other ways you can paraphrase time is to say at the beginning or at the start of the period. You can also say by the end of the period, in the final month or year. 10 years can be paraphrased into a decade, and 5 years into half a decade. When paraphrasing, remember these 4 golden rules. So number 1, make sure you use the correct synonyms. Not any word can replace that one, so you have to make sure it's the correct one. Secondly, you need to change the form of the word. So you need to either change it into its verb or noun, or even into its adjective form if it's possible. Try to change from active to passive. And lastly, try to combine sentences using conjunctions or relative pronouns. And the last thing we're looking at is referencing. So this is another important requirement in coherence and cohesion. And it's basically a way of avoiding repeating the same noun or subject again and again. For example, number of tourists increased gradually from 2% to 5%. Number of tourists then plummeted suddenly in 1990 to 2%. So we've got number of tourists that's repeated twice here. It's the subject and of the sentence, but you should avoid this repetition. And what you can do instead is to use the determiner this and say this figure then plummeted suddenly to 2%. Another way you can paraphrase figure is to say number, count, or percentage. What you can also do is you can use the words the former and the latter. So for example, European and American tourists accounted for 80% of all visitors, with the former, meaning European, making up 60% and the latter, meaning American, 20%. So as you can see in this sentence, instead of repeating European making up 60%, you're saying the former and American the latter. You can also say respectively or correspondingly. For example, European and American visitors accounted for the majority of tourists at 60% and 20% respectively. So when you use respectively, you're basically saying what percentage each subject has, and make sure you follow this order. So the first subject and then the second subject. The other thing is to use one or the other, so you cannot use them together. If you've used respectively, then try to use correspondingly in the next one to avoid repetition. So by using pronouns, determinants, and these expressions, you can avoid repeating yourself, and this means that you're more likely to get a band 7 and above. So let's have a look at that first chart that we looked at in the first lesson. So remember that we had quite a lot of repetition in from and to and number of tourists. So if you go to page 21, what I want you to do is to rewrite this for me, but replace all the circled words with these ones instead. Let's have a look at the answers now. So there was a gradual increase in the number of tourists visiting the UK in the first 4 years of the period, from 2% to 5%. This figure slumped substantially by 3% in 1990. There was a rapid recovery from 1990 to 1992. Visitor numbers experienced a slight decline of 1% in 1993. Tourism improved and reached a peak of 7% in 1994. And lastly, there was an unexpected stabilization between 1994 to 1996. As you can see, this is very different to the first draft that we had. There isn't any repetition here, and that's what you should be aiming for. So now that brings us to the end of module reflection. If you go to page 40, what I want you to do is to have a look at the objectives that we set at the beginning of the module, and then tick the ones that you can confidently do. So can you confidently use a range of nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs to describe changes in a graph? Can you be flexible and precise in describing this change? Can you use proportions, fractions, and composition language to describe comparative graph? Can you use a variety of verbs and noun phrases to describe changes in a map? Can you describe location in different ways by using a mix of compass language and location language? Can you use sequencing and composition language to describe process? Can you write accurate and concise introductions? Are you able to paraphrase countries, time, and some common task 1 topics? And lastly, can you use referencing to avoid repeating yourself? Tell us about your progress and any questions you have. We would love to hear from you. So now take a nice break, a well-deserved break, and get yourself ready for the next module.